So good afternoon and welcome to this new and very special event at the Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en los Estados Unidos. It is a real honor to welcome Professor Richard Kagan for a second time in this research center of the Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University. We enjoyed a brilliant lecture by him exactly 2 years ago in April 2022, when he shared with us his new thoughts, his new reflections about the Spanish craze that hit the US at the turn of the 18th century through the first decades of the 20th century, and which Professor Kagan, as you probably all know, studied thoroughly in his influential and best-selling book, The Spanish Craze, America's Fascination with the Hispanic World. Today, he's going to focus on a very different type of fascination, that which the very relevant American historian, Henry C. Lee, felt for a topic that most of his contemporaries found abhorrent, the Spanish Inquisition. But before we let Professor Kagan have the floor, let me invite Professor Felipe Pereda to introduce Professor Kagan to you, as they've known each other and worked together for many years when they were colleagues, or ever since they were colleagues at the Johns Hopkins University. So thank you very much, Felipe, and thank you very much, Professor Kagan, for accepting this new invitation to speak here, and for your flexibility with the arrangement of this lecture. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Marta. Actually, I've known Richard for much, much longer. I was a graduate student at the Autonomous University when we first met at a dinner at Pedro's house, by the way. I was very impressed and thrilled to be, talking to someone that was already, at the time, that was many years ago, like an eminence in the field. So I'm honored, absolutely, to introduce Richard today. I'm an art historian, and I think that speaks to the work of Richard, that an art historian can also be introducing a historian. Richard is not only a great and prolific author in the history of the Spanish early modern history, he's also a fundamental part of Hispanism in the 20th and now in the 21st centuries, right? For the quantity, but also for the quality of his work, which is kind of immense. I don't know how many, 15 books, something like it. But I would like, if I had to highlight one particular aspect of his work, I would say, maybe speaking as an art historian, that I think the most valuable and certainly the most unique aspect of his work on Hispanism is that he takes this in a kind of holistic, or as a holistic enterprise, in which political theory, but also culture, religion, and of course even the arts are always interconnected. And that's rare to find. And this demands from the scholar, from Richard in this case, not only a deep knowledge of his object of study, but also a very sophisticated kind of writing. In this things get nicely being put together. So he's not only someone that's done incredible research, he's someone that's written beautiful and very interesting books. And this is very well represented in such titles as, I'm thinking of those that have impressed me the most, Lucretia's Dream, Some Politics and Prophecy, the time of Philip II. One of these books built in very deep, thorough, and interesting archival work, which is also the ground, always the ground on which Richard's work has developed. His work on urban identity and cities representations, his work on Vinga Erde, that's a book that really shaped my way of thinking about iconography at the time. I mean iconography in the proper use of the term, the representation of a city. Or books like Inquisitorial Inquiries, The Lives of Conversos and Crypto Jews in the Age of Mercantilism. I should have not done this. But finally, in the last years, I think because of this incredible career throughout so many years, actually I'm going to say something. It is we're in 2024, so it's 50th anniversary of your first book? 50 years. So you've been here kind of forever. But I was trying to say that the most fascinating aspect of his work is that in the last years he's turned, maybe because of the privilege that that experience has provided him, to look into what were the grounds of Hispanism itself, right? To look into the history, you might say the historiography, maybe the stereotypes, the commonplaces, and how these have shaped the way that we look into Spain, and why do we look into it, right? And this is something that it is so important to learn and to know. And as Marta was saying, out of this, only 5 years ago came out this immense, something like 600 pages book called The Spanish Craze, America's Fascination with the Hispanic World, 1779-1939, that is already been translated into Spanish, and of course very well received. And most recently, only 4 years after, the Inquisitor's Inquisitor, that will come up hopefully by the end of the summer, Henry Charles Lea of Philadelphia, which will be published by the University of Pennsylvania. History of this historian and philanthropist, and a history, I believe, of the reasons that brought his attention to Spanish inquisitorial mind as a way to reflect on precisely the opposite way, with the values of a democratic culture. So we're always looking as historians for something else when we look into the past, not just discovering, but also always projecting. And I have to say, before I end, that I knew about this book that Richard has written even before he knew he was going to write it. It was and this is something kind of unique. We were at a dinner with some other friend, David Nirenberg, in Chicago, and we're talking about, these things, and each one of us came up with our latest project. And Richard still didn't have kind of a project. I had discovered or came across some fascinating documents in Philadelphia, and it was. David and I say, this really looks like a book. And, just so many few years afterwards, here we have the book coming out soon. So I'm really looking forward to read this book. I think it's going to be an incredible contribution to the field. And also looking forward to this lecture in which he will give us a glimpse of what the contents of this incredible research consist. So please join me in welcoming Richard Kagan to the podium.
Thank you. You're a hearty band to come late in the day. And I'm also, we have a former Henry Charles Lea professor here, Ann Blair from Harvard. There's three chairs of Henry C. Lea professorships, one at Harvard, one at Princeton, and one at University of Pennsylvania, all created by his son, Arthur Lea, who was a graduate BA from Harvard. Now, thank you, Felipe, for those comments. And in fact, the title, Felipe, of this really comes from that dinner, which cost me 5 years or 6 years of my life, because Felipe said, well, how did he ever write these books? Well, here I am. And I realized that talking late in the afternoon is always a difficulty for speakers and listeners alike, because you're all tired and you probably want to have a quick snooze or have some tea, and I have to do, as a speaker, my best to prevent that. Don't speak too long, number one. Choose a witty subject, number two. And then pepper it with words and phrases that are expressly designed to send kind of electric jolt through the room and wake people up. Fortunately, I have found little in the life history of the person I want to speak about this afternoon, the famed historian of the Inquisition, Henry Charles Lea, that could provide such a jolt. And I'll give you a picture. There he is. Now, as I've researched his life for the past 5 or 6 years, I kept looking for a juicy scandal, something that would grab everybody's attention. And alas, I discovered virtually none, save for a rather chaste love affair with his orphaned first cousin, Anna Jordan, who eventually married. Fortunately, he was 16, they were both 15 or 16 at the time. Lee's parents were on to that relationship. They sent Anna away to live in Cincinnati. They lived apart for 7 years, communicating through letters, and those letters provided me with an enormous cache of love letters dating from the 1840s that are rarely found today. It's a really remarkable cluster of communications. But that physical separation, that is so often the case, brought this young couple even closer together. And they eventually married in 1850, and they lived together until Henry's death at age 84 in 1909. Now, that's the beginning. So any kind of vices, insights to his sexual appetites, forget it. Nothing untoward. Only a Victorian veil of silence is descended on that, although the couple, following their marriage in 1850, did produce 4 children. Raucous parties, revelry. Henry's father, the famed naturalist, conchologist or malacologist. A conchologist is an expert in the study of shells, and malacology is a sub-branch of conchology. It has to do with freshwater mussels, not saltwater mussels, freshwater mussels. Other than he indulged in that, Isaac Lee had a fondness for really good French wine and food, but Henry was far more abstemious, almost a teetotaler, and later in life almost a vegetarian, following what he called a nitrogenist diet. I'm not sure what it meant. A lot of beans, I think. But he did like tomatoes that he personally harvested from his garden of his summer beach house in the resort town of Cape May, New Jersey, where he spent 2 to 3 months every year. Unfortunately, his house is no longer there, but it was probably one of these gingerbread-looking houses, like there's still many in Cape May, New Jersey. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's a place well worth visiting. And if you're a birder looking at birds, it's a really important place on the flyway to see all kinds of storks and stuff. Vices. Here, too, the evidence is rather thin. As a teenager, he loved to play billiards, but seemingly gave up the game after his marriage at age 25 to Anna, as she did not approve of the game. She wanted him to play 10 pins. He said, no, I like billiards instead. Quirks. Some quirks. Well, Lee was relatively short in stature, more or less my height, like me. And as a young man, he worried about his height. And he tried various exercises to try to stretch himself out. He hung from doorways and the like. Although Anna did her best to dissuade him from doing so. And I quote from one of these letters, "You are my perfect man ideal." And she warned him if he got any taller, she would find it difficult to put her arms around his neck and hold him close. Very nice. She also questioned his penchant for weightlifting and the use of what they called dumbbells or dumbbells these days, fearing that he would become far too Samsonic for her taste. No more bulging. She didn't want him too buff, in other words. Obsessions. Well, one, like his father, shells, initially. The reason he was interested in shells, he was interested in facts. But the facts, he wanted discrete. He looked intensely, starting at the age of 15, at the shells in his father's cabinet. And he looked at them as each kind of an isolated incident, trying to look at their morphology, separate one from the other to learn the differences between them, and he would identify any difference as a new species. His father liked to name new species. But this kind of interested kind of looking at small things, collecting facts, looking at these small data points, discrete bits of information. It was a technique he learned from his conchologist father. And later, that kind of close observation, the search for facts, independent facts, is what formed his methodology when he became later in life historian, and a historian of the Inquisition. So kind of an obsession with discrete bits of information, what he called facts, and more facts. He also had politics, was another one of his concerns. He was particularly concerned with electoral fraud and corruption, both local, let's say in Philadelphia, and national and the federal level. And starting in the 1870s, he spearheaded the start of several organizations meant to improve Philadelphia's notoriously corrupt political machine. Those efforts went nowhere, as a famous muckraking politician, journalist Lincoln Steffens commented in 1903 when he described Philadelphia as corrupt and contented. As for national politics, starting already in the 1850s, Lee was a staunch Republican, which in the 19th century meant a believer in classical republicanism. Small government, low taxes. He wanted national tariffs, sounds familiar in some respects, although he always put, oddly, principle above party. And his concern, for example, for civil service reform and an end to the spoils system accounts for his decision in 1872 to join the breakaway faction of the Republican Party known as the Liberal Republicans. Yet he differed from this faction on the question of tariffs. He wanted tariffs, the Liberal Republicans did not, and he also referred to himself as the original mugwump, an Indian term meaning an independent. And he was the original mugwump. There's several articles where he signed it, the original mugwump. So those are obsessions to a certain degree. A few others, but let's not go into them. How about indulgences? These he did have. One was a penchant for fine clothing. As these photos of the young Henry at the age around 16 and a mature Henry suggest he liked to dress up, and he bought fancy clothes. He also had a collection for collecting old master prints. Think Dürer, think Rubens, think Van Dyck, think Rembrandt. He started collecting them by the thousands around 1880 as part of a kind of a rest cure that was ordered by his physician following a breakdown that was associated with his periodic bouts of neurasthenia, which in modern terms translates to stress or depression. He had suffered this breakdown, and his doctor said, don't do any work. And so he decided he would collect prints. And he collected them, and that collection is now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It doesn't go by the Henry Charles Lee name. It goes by his son, Charles, who was the person who actually donated them to the museum. But the 99% of the prints were in Henry's collection. He also liked paintings. His father was a collector. And in fact, he was one of the first collectors in the United States with a fondness for the art of the Baroque, 17th century, basically Italian paintings, which he bought by the truckload. Not very good ones on the whole. Henry also appreciated paintings, but preferably by contemporary artists. Landscapes he liked. Seascapes, perhaps they kind of calmed him down. And he also owned the girl with the white dress, by the way, is still in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He also liked this large canvas by Bouguereau, that hung in his library. And he also had an interest in Greek and Etruscan vases. Good collection, started by his father, now in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. Another interest. Indulgence, poetry. As a teenager, started writing poetry about the age of 15, 16. It provided the kind of the outlet he needed, escape from what he called the long days at the store. And I'll get to this in a moment. His father owned a bookstore and a very important publisher. And it was also a way, through poetry, of communicating with Anna, who was often in Cincinnati, and he would send her poems in every letter they wrote, often poking sometimes fun at the politicians. And in one of his first books, which was never published, called The Student's Tale, he collected this volume of poetry and bound it as if it was going to be published. And it was actually later published 40 years later. And in the 1840s, in his early to mid-20s, he fancied himself a critic of poetry, publishing a series of harshly critical reviews in various journals, the North American Review here in Boston, the Southern Literary Messenger, and others, poking fun at a whole series of 19th century English and American poets, but that career came to a crashing halt in 1847 with his breakdown. And certain criticisms of his own poetry contributed to that particular breakdown. Another indulgence, bibliomania. Books and more books. He started, by the way, that's Anacreon. I didn't mention. He started learning Greek about the age of 6. And he loved Anacreon, whose bust you see there is in the Louvre. And he fancied that he liked to copy Greek erotic poetry, send that to Anna as well. And drinking songs too, which he never liked to drink very much. Books and more books. He started buying them as a teenager. And one of the first he's known to have purchased was the English translation of Juan Antonio Llorente's Critical History of the Inquisition, which Lee first read at the age of 13 in 1838. And this is the first serious book written by a former secretary of the Inquisition, initially published in Paris, and then quickly translated into English. Other books, mainly in French history, followed. And by the 1870s, when Lee first contemplated writing a comprehensive history of the Inquisition, he already owned several thousand books. And that library eventually grew to some 10 or 15,000 books. And to house them all, there's a picture of it. We don't know the exact date of his library, 1880, 1890. He bought a new house in downtown Philadelphia. He added a new addition on the back of it over the objections of his wife, Anna, who wanted a greenhouse. No. But Lee's books took priority over Anna's flowers and plants. And Lee, and I think I have a kind of a plan of the library along with the picture. Lee bequeathed his books and papers to the University of Pennsylvania, which, thanks to a generous gift from Lee's son and daughter, were housed in a special library that included his reconstructed library, and a smaller version of that library is now located on the top floor of Penn's Van Pelt Library, and was recently there. And taken away a few stairways. It's a lot smaller than it was, but there it is, and it's a place that undergraduates take classes in, and graduates as well. So those books were really part, and manuscripts, part of his life. Now, how did he get the money to buy all these books and paintings and prints? And in case you've been wondering, the answer is relatively simple. He was rich. Very rich. A millionaire several times over. The source of that fortune began in publishing, as he became the head of a firm founded by his Catholic grandfather, Matthew Carey. Joyce will know all about Matthew Carey, one of the great revolutionary printers of the 1880s and 1890s, 1780s and 1790s, and well into the 19th century. And it was then taken over by his uncle, Henry Charles Carey, who was a leading political economist, and eventually Henry assumed control of it following his father's retirement in the 1850s, and he transformed it into a specialized medical publishing house, the largest in the country, with exclusive rights to the publication of such perennial bestsellers as Gray's Anatomy, but other books. And he made a fortune selling medical books. He also inherited lucrative investments in coal mines in Pennsylvania. And starting in the 1870s, he made substantial and lucrative investments in Philadelphia commercial property. Lots of buildings in the center city, Market Street, Chestnut Street, Walnut Street, and the like. And through that, he could live in a rather sumptuous, built himself a series of wonderful looking houses. Unfortunately, the first one, built in the 1850s, 39th and Spruce, was torn down, of course, in the 1950s by Penn. Ugly labs now stand in its place. And the larger house, 20th and Walnut, which is about 2 blocks from where I live, was torn down in 1939 to build a parking lot. so much for preservationists. He liked those mansions. He also, in 1880, he also bought a large yacht, the Vega, and with the help from a captain and crew, this was part of his rescue, he sailed first into Finland, then to the Caribbean, and as far south as Cartagena de Indias in what is now Colombia. And he was interested in Cartagena because it was once a city that once had a tribunal of the Inquisition. And in the sense, that rescuer, I said, and that part of that rescuer, he had several of these things in the course of his life. He was a high energy guy, but a very tense guy, and he had periodic breakdowns. And he watched his health, and he watched his diet, and his drinking as well. And I should also mention that Lea was a generous philanthropist, and his beneficiaries, among his beneficiaries is the Free Library of Pennsylvania, which is a very important one because he insisted it be open on Sundays and also open to women. And he also thought it should have electric light. Somebody said, what, electric light? What's that? And he also gave the wherewithal for the Institute of Hygiene at the University of Pennsylvania, really one of the country's first schools of public health. And of course, the physicians got rid of that, and they absorbed it into the medical school, allowing Johns Hopkins and its place over across the street to become the premier institutions for having institutes of public health, as opposed to faculties of medicine. Well, that's all the jolts I have. No more. But now that I have your attention, let me get to my announced topic, the crafting of a classic, Lea's History of the Inquisition of Spain. Now, as I just mentioned, Lea's interest in the topic dates from around 1838 in his reading of Llorente. And it can also be connected with an increasingly critical view of the Roman Catholic Church, especially during the reign of this guy, Pope Pius IX, who's the rather conservative pontiff, whose syllabus of error, decreed in 1864, targeted most of the ideas that his father, Isaac Lea, who was a lapsed Quaker, and his mother, do I have a thing of his mother? No, I don't have a picture of his mother right here. Mother, who was a lapsed Catholic, believed in. They were liberals. They believed in intermarriage. They didn't like religious intolerance. They wanted progressive ideas, and they didn't want to adhere to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And through that, something Matthew Carey, his grandfather, also was practicing Catholic all of his life, but he had a kind of a Republican notion of Catholicism. That is, he wanted local control. He didn't want it coming out of these ultramontanists, as they're known, these guys coming from Rome. He didn't want these bishops, particularly one Irish bishop he didn't like, in Philadelphia telling him what to do or who to elect as a parish priest. It was big scandals in Philadelphia around 1820, which kind of paralyzed the whole church for a while. His daughter, Anna Joden, never walked into a Catholic church after that. She became an Episcopalian, and eventually they both became Unitarians. In any event, they believed in freedom of conscience, toleration for religious minorities, freedom of inquiry and thought, everything that Pope Pius IX did not condone. In short, the actions of Pius IX's conservative papacy epitomized for Lea the unwarranted intervention of religious authority into the temporal realm. Intervention that Lea, he had a special term that he coined well before it showed up in the English Oxford English Dictionary, called sacerdotalism, ruled by priests. One of his favorite terms, along with its cognate, clericalism. And it was interesting, I was doing this research during COVID when you could search use the Hathi Trust, you could search these 4-volume books and go through, put in sacerdotalism, you see how many times it pops up as kind of a research method you couldn't have really done 20 years ago unless you wanted to spend a long time reading these books page by page and keeping track of every time that those words came up. But whatever the ism was used, sacerdotalism, clericalism, both were anathema for Lea. And here I should add there was a bevy of other isms that troubled him as well. Spiritualism, Mormonism, in the realm of politics, socialism, anarchism, communism, populism. In fact, as I was talking to my brother last night, there's only one ism that he liked, capitalism. Once again, the values of classical republicanism, and he was a staunch liberal of that 19th century, in the century sense of the term. Kind of a liberal conservative in today's, a Reagan Republican in today's political vocabulary. Now, Lee's private correspondence, and there's a lot of it, it's all at Penn Library, boxes and boxes and boxes of it that were preserved by his son, and also, I should say, cleaned out by his son, taking out, I think, a lot of the jolts I was looking for. I think there were more there. The son scrubbed the collection. Lee's letters suggest that he worried about sacerdotalism and its effect starting in the early 1860s when he was already a member of the Philadelphia's Unitarian Church. And I think I have this lovely Frankfurt building, which is on Chestnut Street. In response to a colleague who had inquired about, asked him, so what is your religion, sir? He answered, and I quote, what I read in the Gospels is love and charity for all men and for all forms of worship which are not contrary to the restricting of human progress and the crippling of human intelligence. However, he only went public with these views in his first book, a historical sketch of sacerdotal celibacy in the Christian Church. Well, I should say his second book, first published in 1867, a volume that marked his second try at historical writing. His first was entitled Superstition and Force. That had appeared the year before, but that volume had less to do with church history than with legal history, and especially the rules of evidence, as Lee's worried about the nefarious influence of what he labeled superstition, and which was exemplified in his mind by efforts to establish innocence or guilt in criminal cases through appeals to divine intervention. The ordeal, for example, dumping witches into lakes, walking on fire, and the like. He said, how do you do that? And he said, I love the trial by jury system. I want rational rules of evidence, which is not quite rational, but that's what it is. But sacerdotal celibacy, however, marked the start of what he later referred to as his, quote, insensible, odd term, insensible, as if it was meaning unthinking. It was totally thought out. Turn towards church history, a turn that eventually led to the history of the Spanish Inquisition, which was published in 1907, just a few years prior to his death in 1909. And that study, still cited today, represented the second installment in what Lee had originally imagined as a single comprehensive account of the Inquisition, as one letter dating from about 1867 suggests. He said, I have in contemplation a history of the Inquisition, a subject capable of very interesting development. He also hoped that such a study would prove, and I quote, interesting to the general reader and teach some useful lessons. Yet he feared that that project might be one where I may never be able to carry it out, partly because he had already determined that the history would be scientific history, by which he meant a fact-based history, based on archival facts, and grounded, like Leopoldo Ranca and other historians of that generation, based primarily on the interpretation of information culled in original archives. Now, Lee's search for those archival materials began around 1870. Where? In Oxford. A friend had informed him that the university's Bodleian Library, anybody of you been in the Bodleian Library? Some of you have been there? Contained manuscript materials relating to the history of the Holy Office of Spain in the 17th century, the Inquisition. And he wrote to see if he could borrow those materials, apparently unaware that the Bodleian, then as now, has a policy of never letting a book, let alone a manuscript, leave its premises. In fact, you have to make an oath saying you swear you're not going to take anything out of this thing, or else they'll subject you to the ordeal. Yet these manuscripts did. They sent them to Philadelphia in 4 batches over the course of 2 years. I mean, it was unprecedented, thanks to the intervention of Henry Cox, the head librarian, William Stubbs, the Regis professor of history, and some other characters. They did this partly because of Lee's reputation. He published these 2 books already, partly because he was prepared to pay all the costs, and perhaps most importantly, because he was a gentleman. Therefore, considered wholly trustworthy, and thus an individual certain to keep his word. And the Cox and Stubbs and intervened and said, this guy is trustworthy. And they let them go. It's remarkable. You couldn't do that today. That reputation, emphasized in letters of introduction provided by friends such as Harvard's famed Dante scholar, Charles Eliot Norton, was the secret to Lee's ability to amass the facts that obsessed him and that were necessary to write his history of the Inquisition, and to do so without leaving his library study in Philadelphia and without ever venturing into a foreign archive. He never went to Spain in his adult life or childhood. He went to France once when he was about 6, never back. He went to England once, but he never went to a library as an adult. Did it all from Philadelphia. And it's quite remarkable. Now, these letters, the letters that were sent on his behalf, he would contact people in Washington, wealthy individuals all over. These letters generally went to diplomats abroad. And there's Charles Eliot Norton. And people like him, Charles Perkins Marsh. Like Leidecker might remember George Perkins Marsh, not personally. He was America's first ambassador to Italy after the unification of Italy in the 1860s and 70s. So Lee writes to Marsh, and Marsh puts him in contact with people in Florence, people in Rome, people in Naples, people in Milano, people in Torino, people in Venice. And all of a sudden, the wheels of research start grinding. And once the door was open, Lee rushed in with letters outlining the kinds of facts or materials he wanted to consult. First, he had a whole method. He said, this is what I think I want. Send me abstracts of what your archive contends, what kinds of documents. And then he would select what he wanted from these abstracts, order copies of these materials, have them sent to Philadelphia, and then he'd pay via Baring Brothers in London whatever they asked for. You pay by the page, of course. More for Latin than for Romance. And that system worked remarkably well. And by the mid-1870s, Lee, the businessman that he was, constructed the equivalent of an international research enterprise that employed copyists, he called them agents, who conducted archival research on his behalf. And there you have it. In Europe, he had agents in Dublin, Paris, Copenhagen, The Hague, Munich, and Vienna, along with Milan, Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples, as well as Madrid, where he received some assistance from a man called José Amador de los Rios, who wrote one of the first books on the history of the Jews in Spain, and with it some material on the history of the Inquisition. He also had other agents in Mexico City, a guy called Riva Palacios, and Lima, a very distinguished historian by the name of Paz Soldan. In some instances, he got lucky. Archivists in Copenhagen and Halle were so accommodating as to allow them to send the manuscripts, like the Baudelaire had done, to Philadelphia, which he then copied. He had no secretary. He worked night and day. He copied them out himself, and then would turn the manuscripts. And it was quite a remarkable achievement. William Hickling Prescott, famous Boston historian, he worked through agents as well, or copyists. He had one, maybe once they had 2. Lee had a dozen. And sometimes it was hard put to keep up with all the copies of these manuscripts piling up on his desk. Yet not everything went his way, especially in Spain, where the lack of decent catalogs frustrated his research for Inquisition documents then stored in the archive of Simancas. And I'll get to that in a second. And for this reason, he had to put Spain on hold. And in 1882, about 15 years after he began this, or 12 or 15 years after he began this research on the Inquisition, he decided to split his big, giant, grand Inquisition project in 2. He would first write the history of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages, the so-called Papal Inquisition, and then Spain's Holy Office, that of Spain's Holy Office, would follow. Now, in the end, that took time to complete. But in 1887, I think I have a thing, when the third and final volume of his Inquisition of the Middle Ages was soon to be released, Lee returned to what he once called his first love. Really his first hatred, the Spanish Inquisition. And at this point he confessed that Spain's history has never had any attraction for me, but I cannot help taking it up, for the Spanish Inquisition is the controlling factor in the career of modern persecution. I became intensely interested in the curious problem of profound modification wrought in the Spanish character by the Inquisition. What he thought was that it has puzzled me greatly, but I'm beginning to see my way through it. That's in 1882. And see through it he did. And over the next couple of years, using materials previously collected from his book on the medieval Inquisition, he drafted the opening chapters of his history of the Spanish Inquisition. So we're talking about 1888, 1890. And it was then that he contacted a whole bevy of people in Spain, including the famous philologist Marcelino Menéndez de Pelayo. But owing to irreconcilable differences in their views on the Holy Office, Marcelino Menéndez de Pelayo approved of it. Lee did not. They soon parted ways. But he found a helping hand from diplomats, particularly the U.S. minister in Madrid, Jabez Curry, a historian in his own right and a political scientist who wrote an interesting book on Spanish politics. He found help from the legation secretary, a man named Edward Strobel, who ended his diplomatic career in Thailand. And he enlisted the services of a series of other kind of scholars, Pathimelia, a kind of an employee in the National Library, who started copying documents on Lee's behalf in various institutions in Madrid. And then there was others, the chief archivist called the Archivo General Central, which also held the documents from the tribunal the Inquisitorial Tribunal of Valencia. He had other agents in Barcelona, so he could get material relating to the Inquisition there. And soon that pipeline was up and running in accordance with a system that Lee had previously developed. Requests for a list of material, abstracts of what they contain. He would then review those abstracts, request the copies of what he wanted copied at so much a page. And partly for this reason, because he's gathering all this material, he didn't like big, long trial records. And sometimes inquisitorial trial records, like the one you mentioned, of Lucrecia de Leon, my dream girl, 3,000 pages. He said, that I can't copy. It's too expensive. He was frugal. He said, I want a summary of what these want. He didn't want to read all those the testimony of all the witnesses that were called to show up at these proceedings. So he wants summary accounts. He didn't want anecdotes. He just wanted facts. He just wanted to know how many cases there are, who was in charge, what cases, what kinds of so-called crime was involved. He wanted financial records and the like. And so, it's those first researches resulted in a little book, Religious History, chapters in the Religious History of Spain, 1890. Some little accounts in actually Lucrecia de Leon, my dream person, he's the first person to write about her, 1890. And that's why, if you want to look for the deep roots of my relationship with Lee, it goes back to the 1980s. As for the book on the Spain's Inquisition, one obstacle remained. This archive, Simancas, which is in a small town a couple hundred miles north of Madrid, and that housed the archive of the General Council of the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, together with one of the records of this very important tribunal at Toledo, just south of Madrid. And once again, therefore, Lee postponed further work on this history because Simancas wasn't quite yet open. He said, well, I have other things to write about. I'll write a history of confession, auricular confession. And that led to really probably his most controversial book ever written, because he was broadly attacked by various members of the Roman Catholic scholars in this country, France and Spain. But by 1895 or so, the situation in Simancas had changed. The archive then had a new director, And Lee had a new agent in Madrid, a guy called Ignacio Hernandez Figueroa. He was a kind of a functionary, an employee. We don't know very much about him, but he would write to Lee constantly. He did all the copying, or arranged for all the copying, all the payments, sent the material back to Philadelphia. And this continued across the 7 years, continued throughout the years of the Spanish-American Wars. There was a little glitch, July and August of 1898, but it started again in September, and the stuff was piling up, piling up. In the meanwhile, Lee doesn't just want to wait around for the materials. He said, well, I have other projects to do. So he writes a history of indulgences, though that's a Auricular Confession. I got it confused. 1896. He writes a book on the history of the Moriscos, that is the converted Muslims, which has been recently published in Spanish translation and called Lee's Forgotten Masterpiece. So he's collecting stuff on the Inquisition, but publishing 3 volumes on this, or another short book. This is only about 600 pages. And he often self-publishing, because you can see Lee Brothers and Company. He's not going commercial with these books because not too many people wanted to read them. And Lee Brothers and Company had a lot. His son is running it by then and wouldn't say no to their father. So he's basically, by around 1901, when he already had thousands of pages, that he said, look, I have too much on my hand. I got to get to this material. I got to write it. So let's stop copying. I'll get to this stuff. But the book had yet to be written. And he said, oh, my God, how am I going to do this? And he develops what he calls an elaborate analytical index, which he divides into a series of notebooks in which he sorts out all those discrete facts. And he has a whole schema. He says, he has this one called fanaticism, his notion of fanaticism. So he goes through these hundreds of pages of materials. Anything that struck him as fanatic or extreme or something, what we call it perhaps in the 18th century, too enthusiastic religiously, he puts that, why do you have a belief in a holy person or belief in cults of religious of nuns who supposedly worked miracles? He jots this down as fanatical behavior. So the method that he develops in this this methodology, it's scientific. It's based on the facts, but he's slamming his facts, entering his facts into a series of predetermined categories, one of which is fanaticism. Others is called Spain's tardy development. He said, why did Spain lose the War of 1898? We'll figure it out. Something in my records was another category, unity of faith. Anything that struck him as sacerdotalism or clericalism. In a sense, anything that aligned with his notion of religious excess, he puts into that particular category. So, as I said, purchase of indulgences, the worship of these kinds of holy figures, and the like. And here he's much influenced by a whole series of Spanish contemporary writers, so-called writers of the generation of 1898, who basically thought about that theocracy in one form or another had slowed Spain's national or industrial economic development, or in some cases the lack of investment in education. And these guys are talking about that. I can talk about that too. And for Lee, however, the culprit for Spain's, quote, tardy development was even simpler. Blame it on the spirit of what he called the spirit of intolerance, instigated by the church's notion of unity of faith, which in turn, in his view, led to the Inquisition. So once he has all his facts lined up in that analytical register, he writes at a furious pace, day in, day out, rarely taking a day off. 3 hours in the morning, stop for lunch, a couple of hours in the afternoon, maybe in the summer he'll take a splash in the waves in Cape May, look at his tomatoes for a while, a few hours later, Basically Anna's over there. She disappears because the letters disappear, and like a good Victorian wife, she unfortunately fades out. And remember, when he's starting to write this book, he's nearing his 80th year. So he's no youngster. And his approach to the Inquisition was in keeping with his factual-based notion, and what I said before, he doesn't want anecdotes, was largely institutional and legal. He wanted to know how it worked. He wanted to know how many employees did it own, how many cases, what was his caseload across time, what kinds of cases did it try, which he divided into what he called spheres of action, with the overall aim of presenting the Holy Office as what he called an engine of immense power, constantly applied for the furtherance of obscurantism, the repression of thought, the exclusion of foreign ideas, the obstruction of progress, with Spain and its people paying its price. So he had this notion that there was this giant engine. And actually the formulation of the Inquisition as an engine probably dates from around the 1870s, when he first formulated it, when he went to the Philadelphia World's Fair and saw these giant machines at work. People in the 18th century thought about the Inquisition as a monster, Goya. They didn't think about it as an engine. He modernizes it. He makes it into a very efficient, like a modern corporation, humming away. By 1905, the work is done. By then, Lee, the former publisher, recognized that the book was far too long. So he began what he called the drudgery. It's a wonderful term. His word, not mine, for cutting it down to size. He had about 6 volumes then. Essentially by cutting out the sections relating to the work of the Inquisition in Naples, in Sicily, the Americas. And save for his book on the medieval Inquisition, he had always used the family firm to publish his other books on church history. This one he said, this might have a public. Let's go commercial. And he's right. He had published once with Harper's before. Harper's, they had a falling out. He goes to a new firm called Macmillan in New York, in London. And he said, Macmillan decides to publish it, but only after a series of tortuous negotiations in which Lee agreed to pay for the preparation of the plates. He's a publisher. He pays for the print, the preparation of the prints, for the electrotype plates that are going to, that's a good hunk of the cost of the publication. That's a big saving for Macmillan. And even then, Lee proved somewhat of a nitpicker, haggling over what he considered flaws in Macmillan's work as a printer, basically driving the editor nuts, driving him to extraction, what they considered a grumpy old man, a grumpy old printer who knew too much about the production of books. It's very interesting. He said, the color there on volume 2, page 240, the ink is a little light there. Would you please correct that? He would go back and forth in a whole series of letters that are in the New York Public Library. It's fascinating, but they drove them crazy. On the other hand, when Lee agreed to pay most of the cost of all the corrections, they said, okay, we'll do it. And they also agreed to publish a companion volume consisting of, there's the history of the Inquisition on my shelf. And then he published this one, the Inquisition and Spanish Dependencies, stuff on the Americas, Cartagena, Mexico, and the like. Lee's last book, that came out just the year before his death in 1908, and it's a pretty dull book. And it's somewhat clumsy and disjointed. It was far from Lee's best, but it represented his last published work together with his determination, as he called it, to die in harness. Or as he once put it on another occasion, he preferred to wear out, not rust out. It's a great, I guess that applies to me as well. And wear out, Lee did, working furiously on one last book project, a projected book on the history of witchcraft and sorcery. When finally he was writing, he published about wrote about 60, 70 pages on it, and he had collected notebook after notebook of notes on it. Finally, on October 27th, 1909, his body listened to what he had feared previously. He referred to the call that would enable him to find the solution to the eternal riddle of the future beyond the grave. That call eventually came, and Lee disappeared. And we're only left with his remnants This is not his idea. He wanted a simple tomb, kind of a Unitarian tomb, Henry Charles Lea. His son, Henry Charles Lea, said, get the father of Coulter, the famous sculptor, Alexander Sturger Coulter, one of the nation's leading sculptors, to produce this fabulous tomb sculpture of the muse of history, Cleo. When it says Henry Charles Lea, historian, and on one side, in Veritatem Delixi, he loved the truth. On the other, they commissioned sculptures. They made a kind of a book plate for him, put in all the books. And there's the Henry Charles Lea Library and Reading Room, which was an addition to the old Furness building on the University of Penn campus. People didn't like it because it disrupted the Furness building, but now that library and reading room is on the top floor of the Furness library, of the Van Pelt Library in the University of Pennsylvania. And this is Henry Charles Lea. And thank you.
Thank you.
Now you know more about Henry Charles Lea than you need to know.
Thank you so much, Richard. Are there any questions for this really fascinating presentation? Any questions?
Well, I have a question, but it's yes.
Thanks for the recording.
I have a question, but it's prefaced by a couple of comments. First of all, I'm sure he would have taken great pleasure in what Monty Python has done with the Spanish Inquisition.
Yes.
And the second, by way of an anecdote, is one of the things that I've done in retirement and with the leisure of the technology that's available now is when a subject of interest comes up, I Google it and see if a prominent historian or anyone of note has given a good lecture on it. And 9 times out of 10, I will find such a lecture. If you Google the Inquisition, what you get is Henry Charles Lea.
He's still there.
He's still there, and you can hear the audiobooks all recorded, one after the other after the other.
Right.
So now the question has to do, did he look to the antecedents of opinion with regard to the Inquisition? That is to say, Dutch and English antipathy to England or to Spain and to Catholicism.
Yeah, that's a very good question. But I should say, comment, his books are still assigned. And they're heavy going. If you sign Henry Charles Lea to a graduate student, they will groan. Because he has a very tight, he's prolix, but he doesn't like flowery words. And there's not much style in his prose. He was restrained, and so therefore it's not fun, and he didn't want anecdotes. Just lays it on. And he was a terrible footnoter. He didn't like footnotes. He said, why bother? And he didn't like bibliographies. Well, it's all in the notes, he said. And Macmillan, they went crazy. We're supposed to have bibliographies? No, I won't. They published it anyway. His library has everything from back to the 17th century. And I'm going to forget the Dutch guy who wrote it in 1699, the guy who was a friend of John Locke's. I'll think about his name. This is age. He collected this, but he saw those books as polemical works that were based on religious feeling rather than archival facts. And that's true of really up to the Llorente. No one had ever gotten near an inquisitorial archive until this guy Llorente in the teens. He was a secretary. He had direct access to the materials. He published the materials on it. He didn't like the Inquisition. He was living in exile. He published some records of the number of cases that it tried, the Spanish Inquisition, over years. And that's true, but I should say it's true of this medieval Inquisition as well. So Lea wanted to correct all that. He first did it in the medieval book, and then he tries to do it in the Spanish book. He wants to move from the realm of polemic into the realm of history. And he has he just wants to lay it out and explain what happened in straightforward, unvarnished terms. And let the readers make up as he said, their own mind about what the effects of it are. But he's a moralist at heart, because in the beginnings and the ends of his books, he'll say, aha, See what happened. See what happened to Spain. See what happened to church in the later Middle Ages. He will, called the Reformation. He blames the Inquisition for a lot of this stuff. So he has preconceived ideas, but he wants to modernize the history of the Inquisition, and he does, and that's why he's still quoted today. And some of his material, for instance, on Naples, there people show up in Pennsylvania all the time because what he copied, what he had copied from the medieval Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition, and the Episcopal Inquisition in Naples, was bombardiato during the war. So all these Neapolitan scholars show up in Philadelphia, hoping to find tidbits of materials that Lee copied. So if you want to study Naples, you often have to go to Philadelphia, something that Caroline has obviously done many times. And she has.
Thank you, that's me. Thank you, Richard. Wonderful, wonderful talk. And I had wondered when I was reading Lee's book where he got his information, and you've answered that. Now I know I need to go to Philadelphia too. But the other question was, what about the Vatican Library and the Vatican Archives? I can't imagine that he
didn't.
He didn't.
He tried. They had two guys who had permission to work in the Vatican archives, but the section on the Inquisition only opened up in the 1980s and 90s. So he never really wrote the Roman Inquisition, and he never really wrote the Venetian Inquisition either. He basically, the medieval Inquisition that interested him was the one against the Albigensians with the Cathars in the 13th century, and its later manifestations in various parts of Europe. But he never did. He wanted to do Rome, but he never got there. Venice, I don't know why. He collected some information, the Venetian Inquisition, but it was peripheral to his studies.
I've got two questions.
This is my brother.
Yeah.
And speaking of not wearing out,
I
dying in harnesses.
Yeah, I've always had questions for you. But this, I only have two. From the standpoint of all the subsequent, late 20th century, early 21st century work on the Inquisition, what are the main things that Lee missed?
Yeah.
And secondly, can you kind of link what he missed to his character or his life?
Yeah. Well, as I said, anecdote. He didn't want to get bogged down in individual cases. He didn't want to listen to the witnesses. He didn't really want to look at the information that was being adduced in the trial records to assign guilt or some kind of punishment to a particular person who had been arrested by the Inquisition. The big change, and this has taken place really since about the 1980s, starting with Carlo Ginzburg and his work on the what's his name, the guy in the Miller, Pinocchio, is that you're looking now at the Inquisition from the bottom up rather than the top down. He wanted to see as it's functioning as this machine. He didn't want to know what the experiences of individuals who are caught in the Inquisition's nets. And the big change is no one really does the Inquisition as an institution anymore. That's done. And to a certain degree, it was done by Lee and a few other big books that were written in the 1970s and 80s. Now everybody wants to do is study, find a woman, find a black, find a slave, find a witch, and reconstruct their position. And that's what's really, you got to go into the actual trial records of the Inquisition. And that's what's going on. So it's been totally reversed, the perspective. He's looking at it as an institution. And now we're looking at it as a kind of place, as a net where people get caught, but we're using that net to reconstruct people's lives, their systems of belief or non-belief, or whatever they believed, and their life experiences. So we're getting, in a sense, the human side that he had tried to erase. So instead of an institutional history of it, we have a human history of the Inquisition, but seen from the vision of the vanquished, if they want to use it, or the oppressed, or the arrested. So that's the big change. And that trend continues.
Thank you, Richard. Such a Great talk, and I'm sure it's going to be a great book too. So I have a question about the readership, his audience, who's he writing for? And you were presenting an extremely extended network of people that were getting the documents for him. And that seems to speak to kind of a republic of letters, if I may say, of people that share his interests. And this is the first half of my question, which is how does this speak to a kind of a international community that they're responding to Pius the Ninth, ultramontanism, so that precisely in these years the church is responding to modernism in a ways that is very aggressive, right? It's the moment of crisis within the church. They say, "Oh, we've got to respond to this," right? So how much is this about, bringing together a community of people that are responding internationally to these things? And my question will be, is there a correspondence? So does he speak not only to the people that provide the documents, that the people that might, bring him questions, the ideas, the big issues that are at stake? And my second question is just the flip side of this one, which is there also a more parochial audience for this? In Philadelphia, is there any kind of polemics that are going on in between churches, but also in between, different ideologies, different ways of understanding democracy from a Republican or Democrat side? I know these things wouldn't make any sense at the time, but whatever were the parties at contest at the time. Or is he really, writing for, as you were saying, for himself?
Well, that's a couple of questions there. First of all, agents, most of them are Protestants. And certainly the diplomats, they're not Catholics. I think they share his particular vision of the institution, the Inquisition, as a nefarious institution that arrested the development of Spain to a certain degree and Italy. So that there's a meeting of the minds. Well, although some of his agents are Catholics, but the Italians, and it's in the book, I can't remember them all, they tend to be liberals. People who are on the outs with the church. They're the reformers. And this is particularly true of the medieval Inquisition book, which is the book that really sells, much more so than the Spanish one. There's an international audience. It's translated into French, Italian, partly, as well as German. And they were taking out bits and pieces of it and publishing it in little pamphlets to use against the anti-clerical parties in France, Belgium, and Germany are using it against the Catholic Church, saying, "See, this is what happens, and this is what it is, and you can't give any more privileges to the Church. The Inquisition is going to come back." So he finds like-minded people, and that's his audience to a certain degree: reformers, Protestants. Catholics, too, who are in the church but don't like Roman policies. And so he has a community of readers. And I should say his readership is, he writes a lot about, he writes newspaper articles. I didn't talk about all of that. He writes newspaper articles every other week. I mean, on local politics and local reform, New York politics and federal politics. It's a really interesting history of a kind of an elite reformer of American politics, 1870s and 1880s and into the 1890s, his mugwump status. But otherwise, his readership is national. His books are, the Medieval Inquisition is reviewed at every paper just around the country. What they do is they copy. Actually, he often wrote the reviews himself, and then the synopsis, and then the newspapers just publish it and say, here's this great book on the Inquisition. But all the clippings, he employed clipping services that cut out the newspaper articles. They're all in Philadelphia, falling apart. I mean, the 19th century newspapers, but hundreds of them. Hundreds of them. So he has this national readership, and I should dare say he has an international readership as well. I mean, he's a famous guy in his lifetime. Not for the Spanish book. Okay. It's the medieval Inquisition book that really makes his name as someone who's a kind of worried about the role of the Catholic Church in modern society, and they use that book for that purpose. And in a sense, it's often without his authorization. And he said, I didn't want to get involved in his politics. I'm writing history. But it's being used by reformers for that purpose. So that readership is there. And it's an international readership.
It's kind of interesting to note that he was writing for the era of Leo XIII and Rerum Navarra, which is 1891.
Yeah.
So the church itself was assuming or becoming more interested in matters having to do with labor and society and the like.
Right.
So there's a more sympathetic wing of Catholicism that's ready to...
Right, and he finds his supporters, but boy, oh boy,
Yeah.
the guys at Catholic University and the Sorbonne and other places, they jump on the book on auricular confession. That's what drove them nuts. That's the book that he said, this is crazy, this is superstition. And it empowers the clergy to do all kinds of stuff. And he at one point he does a comparative history of crime in France, trying to say that France has more sexual crimes than other places because of the confession. And he's a lousy statistician in that respect. He's getting his information from various people, and they say this is nonsense. He's trying to use these records to get at the church in various ways. But he finds his supporters. Joyce.
Thank you so much. It does strike me as somewhat of a Pennsylvanian story, going back to our kind of Quakerly religious toleration. There should be diversity of opinion, but no persecution of anyone by anyone else.
Right.
And then updating to the 19th century, his enthusiasm for capitalism and industrialization, also very Pennsylvania iteration. My question, even if I thought the Bodleian Library might send me manuscripts, I don't think I would ask.
Try.
But I'm sort of curious I'm curious about the shipping, the preparation, the insurance. So anything you could say about this era of steam travel and commodified transit of information about how this was done.
How does it work?
Because it seems to me like it was a moment where it seemed like a rational decision. You could do this, whereas they probably would not have tried earlier and then decided later not to do it anymore.
Right.
So anything you have to say about
Well, I
that?
think the first one, the Pennsylvania story, yes, you got the history of religious tolerance, and his grandfather, Matthew Carey, is crucial. And Matthew Carey is this revolutionary printer, this kind of a practicing Catholic, but defended Catholics that had the right to be Catholics in a Protestant society, and he's against persecution of any form. And he basically, Lee never went to a school. He learned French when he was 6 years old. He went to a school in France for about 3 or 4 weeks when his parents were on a trip up and down the Rhine. And they left him. They were very worried about it. He was home educated by a very famous mathematician at the time, a guy called Nolte, and his grandfather. And Matthew Carey was a polymath and wrote hundreds of pamphlets on religious toleration, defending Catholics, but saying you have to respect them. Lee, by the 1830s, in the famous riots, anti-Catholic riots of 1836, he's 14, he goes out and stands with a gun in front of St. Patrick's Church to protect it from Protestant mobs. Later, after they put in bells and in steeples, he'd write the church and saying, those bells keep me up at night. They wake me up in the morning. You suppress the 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock bells. This is bad for your health. He had physicians come, this is bad for my neurasthenia. It can lead to death. It leads to insomnia. So he has this. He has nothing against Catholic. He always says, "I have nothing against Catholicism." He does to a certain degree, but he doesn't like their bells. He hates bells. He's a Unitarian by this point. So it's Pennsylvania in that sense of tolerance, and he gets it largely from Matthew Carey, his father, and his uncle. The capitalism comes out of Henry Charles Carey, who was this very important political economist of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, writes these huge books on the principles of political economy that are was the foundation of the economic programs of the Whig Party and then the early Republican Party. So that's where he gets all that stuff from. He's not learning it in school, but he's getting it really, he's home educated in that respect. So in that and his initial focus, he is Pennsylvania all the way. He rarely leaves the place except to go to Cape May. He came a couple of times. They gave him an honorary degree at Harvard, but he didn't want to stay. He put it off for a couple of years. He said, "Oh, it's too long, and I don't want it. My health is poor, and Norton prevails. Come on up, it's not going to kill you." And he grudgingly comes to Cambridge and rushes back to Philadelphia. Occasionally goes to the Delaware Water Gap, rushes back to Philadelphia. He wants to be in that study. And occasionally Cape May. That's what he wants. He's comfortable there. He's got his world there, which he can control that world. He wants that type of control. Now, how does all that stuff get there? And you're right. When I read the letters and how fast the mails worked in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s to get these packages across the Atlantic, it's a week or less. I mean, it worked better today than it does now. They could leave London and they're in Philadelphia in a week. He's writing back instantly. He doesn't wait. And so it's going back. It works like a machine because it's the age of steam already. And those steamships are working on a regular basis. I don't know how many ships are going back and forth between Philadelphia or New York and Liverpool, but they're going regularly. So these things are moving. Now, so he paid for the insurance. He paid for everything. But still, there was some hesitation and worries in London. And Disraeli once criticizes him publicly, saying, that guy Lee, those books and those manuscripts went to Philadelphia, but never came back. And Lord Acton published that in his review of the medieval Inquisition book in the English Historical Review, and Lee was furious. He said, never came back, and he sends in to the editor of the English Historical Review all of his receipts back and forth, and he says, publish this. And they refused to do so. I don't know why, because his honor was insulted. And the Nation, or one of the journal in New York, had nothing to do with it, published it just to save his reputation. So in a sense, it works like a charm, except when it doesn't. That to say, it's not so much the manuscripts. All the manuscripts were returns. It's the copies. And this guy in Madrid, Ignacio, he said, "Oh, the papers came and they got wet and they smell like dead fish, or they were wrapped in bad newspaper and they smell." And Lee's a stickler. He said, "Oh, I can't read it. You have to write clearer copies. I won't pay until you write clearer copies, and you don't enumerate your pages. And I want on every page, I want the bundle and the number of the folio." He wants precision, and when precision doesn't happen, he's furious. And he complains, he moans, he groans. But for all the little glitches and the pile-ups, it works. It remarkably so. And it's amazing that I mean, I'm astounded, because it doesn't work that way any longer.
That kind of transaction across the ocean had already been done by Tickner with Pascual de Gallegos.
No, that's Prescott.
Yes,
No,
sorry.
no,
Yeah.
no.
Not as loans, but as purchases, yeah?
No. Prescott was a Boston historian, wrote the history of Mexico, history of conquest of Peru, history of Reina for Isabella. In the 1840s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, he had this guy working, Pascual de Gallegos, who was an Arabist, working for him both in Simancas as well as in the British Library. And that's the model. But Prescott, who was half blind, he had his secretaries, and who did the copying, helped him. Lee took pride in the fact he did it all himself. There was other American historians, John Lothrop Motley, who was another historian of the of the Netherlands, he did his own research. But so Lee and Prescott are the two guys who really did this kind of long distance research, and kind of a model for others. But they needed a lot of cash, and both of them had a lot of cash to do that. Anne.
Thank you so much, Richard. This was really wonderful. And I wanted to get back to Felipe's question and the copyists. So clearly there are women. You put me on to some great records of hiring some women in Dublin to copy stuff there. So they're the people doing the really pedestrian job. But the men then, who are these agents, are basically behaving like friends. Is it right? But he never met them, it sounds like, unless they traveled to the United States. So what are the, what's in it for them, this sense of having a shared mission? Or are there favors that he's doing for them in return? Is there money changing hands? What is the, how, and obviously letters of introduction, he knows someone who knows someone, and that's how this spreads, presumably.
Yeah, it's networking, yeah.
So I'm wondering about the language of friendship here. Is that what you find in the letters, or is it a language, what are the terms by which he appeals to them?
Well, his letter of introduction is sending a copy of his books. He sends whoever, he said, here's my book. This is a way to establish his credentials as a serious scholar. So he gifts them something. And then he'll ask them, he said, this is my goal, this is what I want to do. And sometimes a little cautious in the first letters. He doesn't play his hand. And they want, and I know this French guy, Legrais from Toulouse, he said, his position on the medieval Inquisition was not as hostile as Lee's. He wanted to sound out more about Lee, and Lee has to leak a little bit more. It took us about 6 months or so before he said, well, I'll help you here. And then Lee says, well, who do you know in Spain? And he said, well, I don't know too many people in Spain. You could write that person, but I know somebody in Copenhagen who found something. So in a sense, it's a community of scholarship. He often writes to people who is a local professor. Now, in terms of the archivists, when I went to Simancas, I said, where are when you write, you can do long distance research in Simancas since the 16th century. It's called a search records. And there's a whole section of the library called search, búsqueda in Spanish. And you can look up, and the lady from Madrid writes to the archivist and said, I want the title of nobility that Philip II gave to my grandfather. Would you please send it? And you pay. And they had a whole bevy of sub-archivists who did this copying for them. So I said, where are these research letters from Lee? He said, well, there are none. I said, that's impossible. But then, when I found this guy, Hernandez Figueroa, and then they looked, the archivist and said, oh, we have all these letters. Lee's name doesn't show up. It's somebody in Madrid. Later it comes up. Some guy in Philadelphia. But they're doing it kind of almost anonymously in some cases. But money is changing hands. And these guys, I looked in the financial registers, they're not registering it. These guys are underpaid, and they're pocketing the money. And they, at one point in Simancas, they're working for Lee full-time. They're not doing much else. They're copying, and they're happy to get the money because they're poorly paid bureaucrats who are underpaid and paid once a year in miseria, to use a good Italian word. And they're happy to comply. And they also see that it's part of a larger enterprise of scholarship, trying to use the archives, and that's what they're interested in.
Fascinating. Although the reason Lee's name doesn't appear, is there some sort of worry about a foreigner?
Initially.
Uh-huh. So
I don't know why. They don't explain it. I have a friend. But in other cases, there is a language saying they respect his work, but they don't like his grumbling and complaining. And Hernandez says, don't complain too much. Just take it and pay. So he's a very interesting intermediary in that respect.
It is a sad story for Spain.
Well, I don't know if it's, well, I'm not sure where these guys are, what their position is on the history of the Inquisition. I have a feeling they didn't like it. So they're happy to help this guy, but they're not sure what he was going to write, did they? So.
Which language did he use in his correspondence with Hernández Figueroa? Was it English or
English.
Spanish? Never
He
Spanish.
rarely wrote Spanish. He wrote French. He wrote Italian. He learned to read Dutch when he was 80, and German later in life too. But he never wrote much Spanish. He was an employee at the embassy. Otherwise, his correspondence to people in France is in French, and French also with the people in Belgium, and he didn't do Italian, but he would read Italian. He would often write in English and say, "I can't write."
I was just wondering because English wouldn't be a commonly well-known language
No,
in
so
Spain
that's
at
why
the
French.
time. Would be French.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Richard. Let me
quite
just.
welcome.
I
Thank
think
you.
he deserves another big applause, round of applause. Yeah. And thank you all for coming and this distinguished audience we've had today. Thank you for your questions,
High-powered
really
audience.
interesting questions. Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard. It's
You're
been a
welcome.
pleasure, very fascinating. And thank you everybody for coming and see you again in another event of the Observatorio.
I didn't show that side. That's what his daughter gave to the Unitarian Church with Henry Charles Lee and Anna. It was done in London, 1912, and it's in the Unitarian Church where he was a pew holder and done after his death. I don't think he would approve it, but it's got Delixis Veritatem in it. And if you look on the scrolls, you can't see it in this reproduction. It's got truth and facts and all that stuff. Everything that he believed in.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.